preparing for war and advancing could likely trigger a war with China. Currently, Chinese troops are stationed in North Korea, so in this situation there's a high possibility of a clash between United States and Chinese forces. This could trigger World War III or even a nuclear war, which is why the United States is very concerned. The battle at 1045 Guard Post and the events that followed were not just a simple local conflict. They signified the tense structure between North and South Korea and a situation right before war. The Korean Peninsula was shrouded in the atmosphere of war more than ever before, and the international community began to closely watch the situation. Anti-Chinese sentiment and support for moving north grew nationwide. Since August 10th, after Jungkook seized Pyongyang by force, anti-Chinese sentiment only grew stronger. When the public learned of many National Army casualties from Bukhan's provocation, they could no longer tolerate it. The justification was simply too good. Eliminating Bukhan's nuclear weapons and unifying the Korean Peninsula like Goryeo did 1,000 years ago could allow the Republic of Korea to follow the same path. Just as Goryeo became a violent empire 1,000 years ago, Korea would need to crush Bukhan and China, which supported Bukhan, to achieve that status. In fact, it's easy to say, but it was an extremely difficult turning point. Most importantly, for Korea, defeating nuclear-armed Bukhan and China was an extremely difficult challenge. Future historians will look at this upcoming war and say it was a choice that determined the fate of the Korean people. Choosing war means accepting blood on our hands, but there was no alternative. Even if we must get our hands dirty, we have to survive in this cruel world. We can erase a stained past, but can't recover a lost present. Korea now faces a choice that will decide its fate. This is the Republic of Korea's government-owned B-2 bunker, one of 9 nuclear bunkers in the country. If war erupts, these 9 nuclear bunkers will become government offices and command centers. This bunker is designed to survive a nuclear strike. Main commanders of each military branch are in position in the B-2 bunker. This place is located underground at the Yongsan Ministry of National Defense building. They were preparing for war by monitoring key areas of North Korea and China through satellites. Top military commanders gradually revised defense plans and began preparing to advance north, with some staying up all night. The B-1 and B-5 bunkers began operating simultaneously. The B-1 bunker near Gwanaksan Mountain housed President Lee Myung-han and key officials. The interior was spacious enough for vehicles to move around, and food supplies were stocked so that hundreds of people could eat for several months. The B-5 bunker at Seoul National University also opened. While the B-1 and B-2 bunkers served military roles, the B-5 bunker was intended for government officials and others. Since the B-1 bunker and the B-5 bunker are located close to each other, the 2 bunkers are connected underground. All 9 nuclear bunkers nationwide are now active. Korea currently holds wartime operational control after talks with the United States. Korea issues DEFCON 2 to the entire military, and when DEFCON 2 is issued, it means the military is at the stage of being fully prepared for war. Reservists are called up, bringing the unit to full strength, and all troops receive ammunition. In addition, combat rations, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear gear, and reserve supplies were also provided. Active duty soldiers from each military branch received new equipment from their warehouses. As wartime items were distributed, soldiers' gear conditions suddenly improved. A few key people took turns sharpening the bayonets with a whetstone until they were razor sharp. And then the military units all left their bases where they were stationed. They moved to an area called Observation Post. The reason for leaving their bases was simple. North Korea and China regularly send spies or use satellites to monitor our troop deployments, even in peacetime. Honestly, despite being called a military secret, everyone, including locals, knows where each unit is stationed. So if war breaks out, the first places to be hit by shells and chemical weapons will be our military bases. That's why most military units leave their bases, as observation post points are typically in the mountains. The reason is to avoid satellite detection, and because enemy special forces mainly infiltrate through mountains. Since these are high priority targets, this also helps prevent civilian casualties from bombings or missile attacks. That's why all major troops are at the observation post points. The Air Force readies for warhead attacks by arming bombers and spreading them to civilian airports and airfields. The South Korean government, still preparing for war, also examined current public opinion in Korea. The South Korean government expected strong public opposition to war with North Korea and China, but public opinion was more supportive of advancing north than anticipated. Everyone knew that no Korean land could be surrendered to anyone. Of course, there were some people who said they wouldn't participate if a war broke out, but they were a minority, and most people quietly answered the call of the nation. Chungmu Level 2 is now declared, signaling full war preparations, government mobilization, and a wartime stance. Chungmu, like DEFCON, is a national alert with 3 levels, Level 3, 2, and 1. It hasn't been issued in South Korea since 1953 until now. DEFCON is usually declared first, followed by the Chungmu emergency. This time, Chungmu Level 3 was declared. Chungmu Level 3 means the government has stated that we have entered a quasi-war state, and it was declared as Chungmu Level 3, which is close to Chungmu Level 2. The mobilization order was issued separately because Chungmu Level 3 doesn't include it. After that, Chungmu Level 3 was declared. Accordingly, government officials were urgently called in. The process of moving important documents to the Busan and Changwon areas continued, and major cultural assets also began to be moved to Busan. The government office became very busy, and as I mentioned earlier, a mobilization order was issued. Reservists nationwide were called up, gathered at assembly points, and transported together by bus as troops deployed. Each military unit distributed its equipment to the reservists. The national system shifted to wartime, prioritizing military supply production and total war readiness. Factories that used to make cars were converted to produce tanks, and industrial complexes that made airplanes or spacecraft began producing fighter jets. It changed in an instant. After over 70 years preparing for war, the country responded extremely quickly. Also, in the case of large trucks, such as tractor trucks, both the equipment and the drivers were mobilized for wartime logistics transportation. Supplies were moved to the front lines, but then the problem shifted. Currently, when producing military supplies, it can take as little as 6 months or as long as 14 months. But even if we change the economic system to a wartime system, it doesn't mean that the facilities can immediately start producing things right away. The facilities themselves need to be changed and more personnel have to be added, so it was difficult for Korea to produce all the military supplies needed for war on its own. Neighboring countries produced Korea's needed military supplies while preparing for war. Some people think that in wartime, the economy will switch to a wartime system and produce various military supplies, but that's a bit short-sighted. It's a shallow way of thinking. If all raw materials are imported, prices will soar, and North Korea and China wouldn't just ignore these factories. Above all, if some groups inside the factories who sympathize with the enemy cause any kind of disturbance, not only will production be impossible, but even transporting stored supplies won't be possible. Shell production begins 6 months after peacetime orders are placed. That's because it takes a long time to secure the materials. Even when the supply chain is smooth during peacetime, it's already like this, so thinking it will be better during wartime is just wishful thinking. So they started to solve this problem with the help of foreign countries. Of course, there was also some public backlash against this. Some said, if we're going to die, just draft us. And others claimed they're sending multinational citizens to die on the battlefield. However, Korea looked very different. Despite ongoing criticism, President Lee Myung-han's approval rating strangely rebounded and began to recover. President Lee Myung-han also believed that many citizens supported his actions, so he pushed even harder with these measures. In China, they were taken aback by South Korea's actions and anticipated a northward advance by Korea, so they made preparations to immediately deploy the Northern Theater Command to North Korea in case of emergency. And they tried to increase the strength of the PMCs stationed in North Korea, deploying heavy weapons as well. They also pressured the PMCs to ensure that more troops would remain inside North Korea. If South Korea moved north, PMCs in North Korea would delay them to give the Chinese military time to enter. China responded to South Korea by sending its navy to the West Sea, advancing its Northern Theater Command, and preparing the Central Theater Command for deployment. Chinese troops in North Korea received their ammunition long ago. Japan saw its first prosperity in years, as many foreign investors put money into Japanese manufacturing, expecting war in Korea. At the request of the United States and South Korea, Japan began mass-producing military supplies. Japan began producing a wide range of military supplies, including ammunition, shells, food, necessities, textiles, metals, vehicles, medicines, and fuels. Thanks to that, Japan regained its economic vitality, and its economic growth rate gradually increased. Japanese companies used this chance to boost defense cooperation with Korea. Inside Japan, there were discussions that a war on the Korean Peninsula would also threaten Japan's security, so they needed to prepare for any possibility. Some argued for gradually creating a national defense force. Around then, Japan moved self-defense force units to Kyushu and shifted the Maritime Self-Defense Force toward the East Sea. At that time, the United Nations Command in Japan began helping Korea. The United Nations Command was created during the Korean War to defend South Korea against North Korea's invasion. It fought with South Korea against North Korea and China, and still operates as a multinational force in South Korea and Japan. The United Nations Command's main mission is to uphold the 1953 Korean War armistice, connect the Republic of Korea United States Combined Forces Command with the international community during emergencies, and support military contributions from member nations. In other words, if a war breaks out, the member countries of the United Nations Command will participate. The member countries of the United Nations Command have also begun to express their support for South Korea and indicate their willingness to participate in the event of an emergency. In fact, everyone knows how big of a decision it is to go to war. President Lee Myung-han stared wearily at the report on his desk. They were documents detailing projected casualties and war length if South Korea preemptively struck North Korea's nuclear sites. The document stated that a full-scale North-South war would cause over 50,000 civilian casualties, and long-range attacks on the capital by North Korea would result in many deaths. Each time I turned a page, the paper's sound filled the quiet room. Deciding to go to war meant taking responsibility for countless lives, and the moment you made that decision, you were stepping onto a path you could never turn back from. It was too hard for one person to decide. Minister of National Defense Lee Jong-hwan quietly entered the president's office. He brought the operation plan prepared by the military. After looking at President Lee Myung-han for a while, he quietly began to speak. And as if giving advice, he spoke to the president. He said that although he knew the president had a lot on his mind, only the president could make this decision. If President Lee Myung-han chose war, he'd be responsible for many lives, and people would resent him. President Lee Myung-han felt weighed down with no strength in his fingers. Minister of Defense Lee Jong-hwan silently looked at the president, then firmly placed a document on the desk and spoke. However, Defense Minister Lee Jong-hwan seemed supportive. He said that if we don't make a decision now, our children will have to live in an even more terrible world, that North Korea and China are waiting for us to back down, and that if we don't decide now, we will be dragged around by them forever. President Lee Myung-han paused, then questioned if history would judge this decision the same. Defense Minister Lee Jong-hwan responded that history would judge, but it would not remember him as a coward. He asked him to decide, saying the military was ready. President Lee Myung-han and Defense Minister Lee Jong-hwan stared at each other. President Lee Myung-han quietly clenched his fist, his fingertips steady. He then slowly picked up the pen in front of him. And President Lee Myung-han gave the order to the entire military, approving the transition to full-scale war readiness. He also approved the order to carry out wartime operations. Even in the United States, they seemed surprised by South Korea's response and asked South Korea not to overreact. This was because they had already reached an agreement in advance during talks with China on how to respond in the event of a war. While challenging China, Russia, and North Korea, the United States also looked for potential benefits from the war. But the most important thing was to prevent this war from escalating into World War III. It was a sequence similar to what happened during the Vietnam War. The United States, concerned about escalation, had South Korea deliver the message that they would not advance north of the demilitarized zone. They said they'd support rear security, logistics, supplies, intelligence, and air and naval operations. South Korea said the United States declaration undermined the Republic of Korea-United States Alliance's foundation, but also had additional views. They judged that the United States was finally supporting South Korea's advance northward, and to give South Korea confidence, the United States even declared its support for South Korea's advance north. South Korea planned to move north, with the United States pledging full intelligence and surveillance support. They detailed the reinforcement troops they would send to South Korea, allowing South Korea to finally feel confident. All this occurred without knowing what secret talks with China were happening. In fact, South Korea had many chances to move north by then. It was actually amazing that a war didn't break out, considering North Korea carried out more than 3,000 military provocations. If this were Israel, it would already be chaos, but this time felt different because the United States backed the northward advance. President Donald Trump, with a business background, kept analyzing the numbers. It was concluded that a full-scale war with China would cause unacceptable damage to the United States. That was understandable, since such a situation would force heavy casualties on the United States military, and above all, the possibility of World War III or even a nuclear war could increase, making the United States hesitant to go to full-scale war with China. In fact, since World War II, the United States has never directly gone to war with a power that divides the world. All of its wars have been fought in the form of proxy wars. It was the same this time as well. It was a way to have Korea fight China instead, so that China's national power would be exhausted, all while not causing any harm to themselves. It was truly a cunning and devious method. But it was a method that fit perfectly in such a cruel world. The United Nations also held an emergency meeting and began to discuss the Korean Peninsula issue. The United Nations Secretary General called for an immediate end to all military conflicts on the Korean Peninsula, but the world divided into two sides, each acting in their own interests. Russia and China opposed North Korea's attack on South Korea, while the United States and United Nations command countries supported South Korea's right to freedom. It felt like this situation could lead to a third world war. On August 18th, Tuesday, President Lee Myung-hwan of South Korea gives a national address. He aimed to update people on events in the Korean Peninsula. President Lee Myung-hwan appeared tense. He straightened his clothes and read over the address again. On August 18 at 10 a.m., a public address took place at the presidential office. President Lee Myung-hwan appeared tense. He then gave the public address, which included the following. Dear citizens, today I stand here to deliver a very important message to protect the sovereignty of the Korean Peninsula and our Republic of Korea. The Korean Peninsula is at a crucial turning point, and our unity and resolve are urgently needed. The Republic of Korea government will take full responsibility and address all situations on the Korean Peninsula. Let me be clear. The Republic of Korea claims the whole Korean Peninsula. The Republic of Korea is the only legitimate government of the Korean Peninsula and its adjacent islands, and we no longer recognize the North Korean regime as an independent state. North Korean residents are also citizens of the Republic of Korea. After the fall of the Kim Jong-un regime, North Korea fell into a state of anarchy, which poses a serious threat to peace and order on the Korean Peninsula. However, this crisis is also an opportunity to accelerate the unification we have long hoped for. It is the responsibility of the Republic of Korea to restore order and stability in the North Korean region, protect our citizens, and provide humanitarian aid. Fellow citizens, unverified information has been spreading quickly online and in society. Behind this is an organization called the Wu Mao Dang from China, which is spreading false information and distorted public opinion to divide Korean society and weaken our resolve. We firmly warn that no force can shake the sovereignty of the Republic of Korea or the will of its people. It is time for us not to be deceived by fake news and false information, and to show our united resolve. The government will respond strongly to this kind of information warfare and will take strict legal action in accordance with relevant laws and regulations. We ask all citizens to pay attention to the government's official announcements and to trust reliable government sources. The Chinese People's Liberation Army is now in Pyongyang and other North Korean areas conducting illegal military operations. China's military intervention violates sovereignty and threatens peace on the Korean Peninsula. The government of the Republic of Korea cannot tolerate this and firmly demands that the Chinese military withdraw from North Korean territory within 72 hours, that is, within 3 days. If they do not withdraw within the deadline, the Republic of Korea will take all necessary measures to protect our people and territory. Dear fellow citizens, we are now facing a historic challenge. However, if we unite as one, we can surely overcome this challenge. Korean Peninsula unification is essential. South Korea's future relies on our unity and resolve. Despite outside interference or obstacles, we will achieve independent unification. Now is the time to show the world the Republic of Korea's true strength. The government will stand with the people until the end, and no threat can stop us. I once again ask for your cooperation and unity, fellow citizens. Please join us, citizens, in pursuing freedom, peace, and unification for the Republic of Korea. Thank you. It was a remarkable speech. Afterward, Korea united even faster. Following South Korea's address, global markets shook, exchange rates soared, and the Korea Composite Stock Price Index dropped. Foreign investors withdrew from Korean stocks, triggering circuit breakers. Financial authorities began to consider freezing the Korea Composite Stock Price Index, and Korea securities dealers automated quotations. Naturally, the exodus of foreigners leaving Korea continued. Some celebrities who were popular in Korea were also seen leaving the country, which drew a lot of criticism. There were also Koreans leaving Korea. Korean airports were nearly shut down, with foreign governments sending charter or military planes to evacuate their citizens. An exodus began in Korea. The United States also started preparing for this. Over 3 aircraft carrier strike groups, along with nuclear submarines and Aegis destroyers, were deployed near the Korean Peninsula and Japan. Currently, about 136,000 Americans live in Korea, and an emergency evacuation order was issued for them. They gathered at United States bases like Yongsan and Pyeongtaek, then wore identification bracelets with their information. They then went to Daegu or Gimhae Airport and were quickly airlifted to Okinawa, Japan, on United States military planes. They were then moved from Okinawa to the United States mainland. The United States government expected that this civilian evacuation would take about 10 to 14 days. On Armed Forces Network, the radio station of the United States Forces Korea, Bing Crosby's White Christmas kept playing. This song played during the United States military's evacuation in Saigon in the Vietnam War. After hearing the song White Christmas, American citizens gathered at the designated assembly points and left Korea. At that time, civilians from United States allies like Canada and the United Kingdom were evacuated together under the plan. In particular, carrier strike groups also arrived in Japan one after another. Each carrier strike group is composed of a cruiser, 1 or 2 destroyers, 2 or 3 nuclear submarines, and support ships. Each carries 80-90 aircraft, including fighter jets, and about 6,000 crew members, including Marines and Navy. If 3 carrier strike groups are sent to the Korean Peninsula, dozens of warships could launch up to 1,000 Tomahawk missiles at North Korea's nuclear sites, air defenses, and command centers. At that time, the United States had positioned the 3rd Fleet, 5th Fleet, and 7th Fleet nearby so they could be deployed directly to the Korean Peninsula. The United States will also use various reconnaissance and surveillance assets to supply South Korea with extensive information. They gathered current information on North Korea's main facilities. This information goes straight to South Korea's key commanders, greatly aiding their decision on where to advance. The United States started monitoring North Korean airspace with all available reconnaissance aircraft, including the E-8 Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System RC-135 Rivet Joint and RQ-4 Global Hawk. The United States tracked North Korean troop movements live and informed South Korea. They used the electronic attack 18G Growler to disable North Korea's air defenses with electronic warfare. In addition, there was an ongoing situation where an unidentified person from the United States continued to provide information for South Korea. This is Hongcheon. This is where the 11th Maneuver Division is located. The 11th Maneuver Division belongs to the 7th Corps and is responsible for advancing north during wartime. All 11th Division brigades were mechanized and infantry units. This place also gets very busy. Especially, it cost an enormous amount of money. There were so many cases where a single unit had to exceed its annual budget. Since we were preparing for war, there were just too many expenses. A single military training exercise can cost tens of millions of won. The military is an organization that consumes money, not one that produces anything. Since the whole division moves under the D2 order, everything costs money: food, clothing, sleep, even bathroom breaks. So, like other units, the personnel officer of the 11th Mobile Division racks his brain over how to reduce these expenses and how to secure more budget. If war breaks out, the country could go nearly bankrupt, though some argue that wartime demand can boost the economy. But that's only a short-term effect. In the short run, it's actually a huge blow. Just before sending soldiers to war, every system in society runs at full capacity, temporarily boosting productivity. But eventually, the output is not civilian goods, but military products, which are not supplied to the domestic market needed for economic development, so as a result, the economy rapidly declines. Given the scale of the war in Ukraine, they increased the defense tax from 1.5% to 5% to address the budget shortfall. They also submitted a bill to Parliament to impose taxes on individual business owners and companies. Ukraine spends about 112 trillion won annually, with half allocated to defense. In comparison, their revenue is only 59 trillion won, so they are covering the budget shortfall with foreign aid. That's why even in Sun Tzu's Art of War, it says not to drag out a war. However, even during the process of preparing for war, they started to experience a shortage of funds. This was a very serious warning sign. In the B2 bunker, top military commanders discussed attack timing and location using the air traffic control system map. In fact, the location was obvious. We had to eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapons before advancing north, since a nuclear strike could kill hundreds of thousands of troops. Disabling their nukes was essential. Special forces inside North Korea continued sending reports to the government. They identified all the major facilities near Wonsan and Nampo and sent their locations. They were operating according to the president's orders. President Lee Myung-hwan asked the military a question. He asked if North Korea's nuclear facilities could be fully neutralized. The National Intelligence Service said it was impossible. They said missing even one nuclear missile would be disastrous. Strategic Command agreed. They said North Korea's nuclear missiles are spread across the country and are a threat because its submarines also carry SLBMs. They said destroying all North Korea's TLs is impossible and inefficient, further troubling the military. Strategic Command then devised a clever solution. There is one process that must be followed in order to launch a nuclear missile, and that is the approval of the Joseon Labor Party. Since Kim Jong-un is absent, a nuclear missile needs approval from both Kim Yo-jong and the North Korean Supreme Command. If either is neutralized, a launch isn't possible. South Korea's military reanalyzed New Joseon's data and located the North Korean cabinet's hiding spots. It also matched the information sent by someone from the United States. The South Korean military planned to eliminate all North Korean leaders to stop nuclear missile launches. The headquarters said they worked hard to prepare for this day, and we could trust them. The bunker's atmosphere quickly became solemn. It felt like we were awaiting history's judgment.
This time at the center. Korean subtitles by Han Hyo-joo. Korean subtitles by Han Hyo-joo. Korean subtitles by Han Hyo-joo. Korean subtitles Han Hyo-joo.
Korean subtitles Han Hyo-joo. Korean subtitles Han Hyo-joo.